So we think about how in this course so far, we've been talking about our own identities and our perceived identities and our perception of other identities. And when we think about interpersonal, one thing we can do is to imagine where the other person's identity features connect to ours and what we can learn from the others. So thinking about learning, one of the things that we can do to make it a little easier to engage across difference is to be curious. So when you're checking an assumption and you realize that you've made an assumption, be curious about what that is, what is different, what you really don't know about. And then we can use counter cues. And counter cues are little tools that we can do to enhance our curiosity. So we can stop, and one counter cue we can say is, what is known about this other person or culture? And instead of making an assumption about what you know, asking, what do I know? What don't I know? And that to me is a really powerful question. What don't I know leads to curiosity questions rather than leaning on the things that are potentially assumptions of what you do know. And then going further, another counter cue might be what possible skills, talents, attitudes, and knowledge can be learned and shared? What can I learn from this person? In that story about the 100-year-old man, I should have learned a ton from him because he knew so much more than me. But in our relationship, it was he who had to learn from me because I was the orthopedic practitioner and he was the one who needed help. So one of the counter cues we can do that helps us to be curious is to check our assumptions. And another one we can do, and we'll be talking about this a lot more in the next installment, is to use open-ended questions rather than closed-ended or leading questions. So rather than yes/no questions, thinking about what can I learn? And then the last thing to think about is listening to learn rather than listening to speak. Or what we often do when we're making assumptions is we listen for data that supports our assumption rather than really listening to learn and check those assumptions. What I alluded to earlier was looking for connecting identity traits and perspectives because we have so many things about us and we're all human and we have these connecting traits. And even though there may be many, many differences, there are things that we can definitely connect through. One piece of advice that I got from a dear friend is to ask, what stories am I telling myself and what other stories are there? So when we're interacting with each other and we don't understand someone's behavior or what they're saying, this is something that's really helped me to stay curious. What stories am I telling myself and what other stories are there? So let's think about evidence of where these interactions have been in your life and mine. Think about a time when you learned something unexpected, maybe from a person with a different identity feature than you. And I often think about things that I've learned from people. For example, I learned that culturally, in some places, a haircut is a lot more than a haircut. I didn't know that, but I learned about it. And I learned from a person who had a different haircut than I did. So maybe think about a time where you learned something and write down the identity difference. And then maybe what you learned from that person. You can list, if you wish, the assumptions that were made, and they could be made by you or by both if you got deep enough into conversation to understand those. And then maybe think about any connecting identity characteristics. So the person I learned about hair from, we both played volleyball together. And so we spent time together enough to learn about each other and to be able to ask questions about hair, for example. We've been talking about individuals and interpersonal things.